Before opening the floor for question, I notice we have some guests here, and from OPG, I don't know if you intend on making any comments at this time.
Thank you, President Binder. For the record, I'm Alan Webster. I'm the Director of Nuclear Regulatory Affairs for Ontario Power Generation. We don't intend on making any comments. We are here and pleased to answer any questions you have about our contribution to this important study.
Okay, thank you. So let's jump right into it, and I'll start Monsieur Tolgesi.
Merci, Monsieur President. Before I will ask any questions, I should tell you that I read this study with great interest, although it will be submitted to a public consultation. I think it's a good report. It fully covers aspects of hypothetical severe nuclear accident, from accident to mitigation to health effects, and for these reasons you and your staff deserves congratulations and recognition. I think it was a great report. I will go. Oops, what is that? On the page 19 of the what's CMD, you are talking about population-weighted dose approach. Could you elaborate on the importance of this population-weighted dose approach and the average dose approach? What's the difference and how it impacts?
Melanie Rickard, for the record, Acting Director of the Radiation Health Sciences Division. Essentially what that boils down to is, in terms of the results that were provided to us by OPG and in terms of the results that we subsequently analyzed to present human health impacts, those were in terms of concentric rings, essentially, around the plant at given distances. But in terms of the modeling that was done, there are subdivisions of those rings. So there are basically smaller areas within those rings where they can, in fact, determine the doses to the individuals that might be impacted, or the hypothetical population, I should say. So they simply weighted all of those different subdivisions to give us our results according to the kilometer distances. So it was essentially just a typical weighted average approach to give us the results that we input. This essentially simplified so that we weren't presenting an inordinate number of results.
Because the weighted average is a little bit different of the total population divided by total. It's different. So I wanted to know what's the difference, what's the weight of this.
So, Patsy Thompson, I'll add a little bit of detail and then ask if OPG want to elaborate. Essentially, we needed to have information on, because of the behavior of the plume and the consideration of the actual weather, meteorological conditions on the Darlington site, we needed to have information on, as the plume moved, how many people were being affected by the plume. And so the grid that is presented, we put on top of it the demographic information. And as the plume moved, and essentially OPG ran several runs of the dispersion and the dose calculations to take into consideration changes in weather conditions reflective of the Darlington site. Each of that information was added, averaged over the population, so we had an average exposure for individuals in that sector. And that information was then used in the risk assessment.
According to the study, what you are saying on page 28 is that the primary zone evacuation time is estimated to be less than 9 hours. This is done by OPG. I think it's OPG study. Now, besides OPG, are there some other evacuation time estimates by other agencies or organizations? I don't know, Durham Emergency, Ontario, or outside of Canada and other jurisdictions?
So, Patsy Thompson, for the record, I'll start and then I'll ask Luc Sigouin to provide more information. And so the time estimate studies were done by OPG for each of the Darlington new build environmental assessment, as well as for the Pickering refurbishment environmental assessment. CNSC staff had an independent review of those studies to assure ourselves that the work done by OPG's consultants was appropriate. And I will ask Luc Sigouin to provide details on the CNSC review.
Thank you. Luc Sigouin, Director of Emergency Management Programs at the CNSC, for the record. So Dr. Thompson's correct. The studies, the evacuation time studies that were undertaken by OPG were sponsored by OPG. They were undertaken by recognized experts in the field who do similar analysis for U.S. nuclear power plants and the areas surrounding the plants. Those studies were done for both Pickering and Darlington. At the time, in 2008, CNSC staff had those studies peer-reviewed. We hired an independent consultant who reviewed the approach, the methodology, and the results obtained, and confirmed that the results were indeed accurate. There was a possibility of a small margin of error associated to it, but certainly within the time allotted in this study. So we are confident that in the evacuation time estimate methods that were used by OPG.
Perhaps, Mr. Giorgesi, if I could add, your question was a little bit broader in terms of other work and other experiences. At the time the work was done, taking into consideration the experience from Katrina, where people did not necessarily use the routes that the authorities had indicated. And so the experience from large natural disasters was used by OPG's experts and taken into consideration by the CNSC peer reviewers.
Maybe it's a good time to verify from the people who actually would be managing this. I understand that Mr. Nodwell, you're representing the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management. Do you concur with these studies? Is that your planning horizon?
Thank you very much, President Binder. Dave Nodwell, Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management, for the record. Yes, we rely on this data. Currently, we're looking at projections in the Darlington, as an example, for the year 2025 of a 7-hour evacuation under hazardous conditions. So in terms of a snowstorm, and in less time if it's in clear conditions, a bit longer for Pickering. We are supportive of this information. We are, however, through the Ministry of Transportation, they're developing some traffic modeling software that they're currently testing, and I hope to hear soon in terms of when that would be implemented and available for use. So that would help verify and validate the study that was conducted through OPG.
Thank you. Mr. Giorgesi.
And it's not necessarily a drill or exercise to evacuate, I don't know, 100,000 or 1 million people, but in natural disasters in the world, there were some areas where, occasions where a large number of population was evacuated. To your knowledge, do you have some similarities when you are talking about, we are talking about a large population here, if you include Toronto or part of Toronto, and so if you consider that what's happened like in Los Angeles, where it was an earthquake, what was the evacuation time and how it compares to what we are looking to?
Patsy Thompson, for the record, Ms. Lane is... Okay, so...
There's another chair you can mingle with a...
Okay. But perhaps before Ms. Lane gets to a microphone, when the time estimate studies had been done, CNSC staff had met with the Toronto City Police to talk about these studies. And the reaction from the Toronto Police were, when they saw the numbers of people that had to be evacuated in time frames, sort of went, well, this is sort of the number of people who come in and out of Toronto every day. So they didn't seem to think it was a particularly large number of people who would need to be evacuated around the Darlington or Pickering areas if there was an accident. But in terms of your specific question around the LA, I don't have that information.
Ms. Lane?
Rachel Lane, for the record. To put it into perspective, during the Fukushima accident, and keeping into mind that there was a tsunami and an earthquake as well as the nuclear accident, evacuation started March the 11th before the reactor had any releases, and the evacuation of 20 kilometers around Fukushima Daiichi was completed by March the 15th, and over 200,000 people were evacuated. Thank you.
That's a lot more than 9 hours.
Just to tell you, you were talking about police. It's one thing to come to work and go home from work, where, you know, if I'm coming and something happens and I'm two hours later, it's one thing. Or I'm leaving, it's 2 hours later, it's okay. But when is this type of accident, I think the stress and the population will be trying to go out. There will be a kind of different type of problems and traffic jams.
So, Mr. Tolgesi, I wasn't trying to discount the trauma of being asked to evacuate in that kind of circumstances. It was just to put the numbers in perspective and the time estimates that were done by this for the study. But I think John Peters from OPG had additional information.
John Peters, for the record. I'm the manager of environmental assessment and was responsible for the work that was done at Pickering, Darlington, and New Nuclear projects related to this matter. I just wanted to speak briefly about the complexity of the type of modeling that we're referring to here. And I think it gets to your point, Dr. Tolgesi. The way the model is built, it has a series of step functions that it looks at based on experience from many, many events over the world, and it is constantly updated to reflect that insight. So, for example, when we first ran the model, they ran it without the understanding that there would be a large shadow evacuation beyond the primary zone, which needed to be fully considered because it created blockages and complexity to the model. We did that work and updated the models at various steps to get to the picture that we're presenting here today. If you look at the individual's role in all of this, which is really the most important part, how do they assemble themselves, get over the shock of this, decide what they have to do, and then actually begin evacuation? That takes about half of the time of the evacuations. And when we actually go through examining all of the model sequence steps, the first one is assembly and planning by the family and members of the community who have to have been told they should do something at that time. So it included, for example, all of an assessment of all the people who worked out of the region who were evacuating, who would automatically be called by their spouse or partner and who would come back home as a first step, because often there's only one vehicle in the household. And so that is an important aspect of this. They looked at and considered all of the commute times back into the area that's being evacuated. We then examined the contribution of all of the preparations and things needed. For example, a farm community has to decide how to manage all of its animals and other factors that are important to them before they can actually move away from their property for a period of time that's unknown. So those are also considered by segment of the population. The industries that are affected are all examined in terms of styles of work and things that have to be done to make those properties safe while there is a removal of staff. So there's a whole preparation phase, followed by then the beginning of actually people moving. And that also has its timing. It's related to the people who are collectively moved versus the people who individually move, the role of the police, the opening and closing of roads, and the direction of traffic. And all those communication tools become really critical as those steps go forward. So we have actually time estimates for each of these phases of work, leading to 50% evacuated, 70, 90, and eventually 100% evacuation. And all of those are included and assessed on the specific conditions in the primary zone and the shadow evacuation zone. So I think you can begin to see from what I've said the complexities of this kind of modeling.
Okay, we got to move on to, there'll be another round. Yeah. Dr. McEwen.
So again, congratulations. I think this is a really nice report. I'm just going to, I think, start by talking about the cancer incidence rate and the excess cancer incidence rate. Some of the phrasing worries me because I'm not actually sure who the target audience of this document would be. Some of it is written in a way which is trending to a lay description. Some of it is trending to a specialist description. I think it would be very helpful for relatively straightforward lay explanations of what a baseline cancer incidence is or what a baseline cancer rate is. And you use 2 or 3 different descriptors of the increased risk, very subtly different, but you use 2 or 3 different terms. So could you just give a lay explanation of what a baseline cancer rate would be or a cancer incidence rate would be? And then how do you describe, if you take childhood thyroid cancer, that increased risk with respect to the baseline expectation in an Ontario population?
So, Dr. McEwen, I'll address some of your points early in terms of the whether this report is intended for a lay audience or a specialist audience. And then I'll ask Dr. Zablatska maybe to provide some of the lay person description of baseline cancer and in relation to thyroid. The report ultimately will be hopefully useful for a lay audience. Recognize at this stage that it's a mix. What we've done for other reports that had very technical sections that where we want to preserve enough science to withstand a peer review and also meet the objectives of someone reading the document and finding it informative. For the tritium reports, for example, what we've done is extended executive summaries or long summaries where a lay audience could have a good sense of what the technical parts of the document are saying. This hasn't been done yet. The intent would be to do it after the end of the public review when we're getting the documents finalized for publishing on our website. And I'll ask Dr. Zablatska perhaps to address your questions on baseline and thyroid cancer.
My name is Lydia Zablatska. I'm a radiation epidemiologist from the University of California, San Francisco, for the record. So baseline risk for this particular study was defined as a risk that would be expected in a population depending on the sex and age at exposure, lifetime risk of developing all cancers combined, or thyroid cancer, or leukemia, without any exposure to radiation. These numbers that we have are based on the 2000-2005 observed cancer incidence rate in the US. And as we show in the report, they are very comparable across different ages and sexes to the Canadian incidence rates. And then, so we used the RAD tool to estimate the excess that will be above the natural background rates. And so these numbers are very small. We're showing, for example, that for all cancers, the lifetime increase in the probability of developing any type of solid cancer after exposure under these scenarios would be only 0.42 chances on top of the existing 49,000 plus cancers in a population of 100,000 people. So essentially we are saying that using these rates, every second individual over lifetime will develop some type of solid cancer. Due to radiation exposure from under these scenario conditions, the only additional due to radiation would be less than half of one cancer case per 100,000.
So,
can I ask, first of all, the 49% scared the hell out of me, I'll tell you that. That's the first time I've seen that number so starkly displayed. What's the error in this number? Plus or minus 49% is presented as the background, but it doesn't have any error margin in it. My question is, on the 49%, if it's plus or minus 1%, it'll mask any of these effects altogether. So I have no idea how you can actually come up to any conclusion given the low numbers.
You're absolutely right. The 49,000 out of 100,000 in a lifetime is a central estimate. So the red actually gives the lower and upper 90% bound for that, because cancer rates, of course, fluctuate year to year in different age groups. And so we do provide these bounds. They were not shown on the slide, but in the report we provide those bounds. And we provide bounds both for the background rates and also to excess rates. We provide 90% low and 90% higher upper bound of these estimates.
If I could, Mr. Binder and Dr. McEwen, if you will recall the Radicon report where we had tables where we presented variations in cancer incidence across different health regions in Ontario, you saw that there was a large variability with certain regions having higher cancer, certain cancer incidence rates for certain cancers, and for other cancers, it was other regions that had higher levels. So there is a large variability. For the purposes of the study and the representation, we have simplified it. But as Dr. Zaplatska said, the detailed information are in the appendices. One way that for someone who, like me, who's not an expert in cancer statistics, when I look at page 55 of the report, which is figure 6.7, that speaks to childhood thyroid cancer, which relates to your question, Dr. McEwen. When we look at the natural baseline cancer rate for thyroid cancer in children, it's the probability of getting cancer is 1,078 out of 100,000, which is about 1%. And with the highest cancer risk for that scenario, which is the 24-1 scenario, the additional 41 cases or 41 chances of getting cancer, you essentially go from 1.078% plus 0.041%, which gives you a total risk of 1.119%. And you're right, taking into consideration regional variability, you would not be able to detect these types of increased cancer rates.
But again, as a layman, I can tell you that people will play with those numbers, and we'll have to get used to trying to explain this. So if you look at the next chart, the one that is the childhood thyroid, and the number of 301. So you guys keep talking about it's only 0.3%. But if I were, I could play with numbers just as well, and I say, well, but it's increased 30% over the baseline. 30%. That's the number that everybody will look at. As you know, we're measuring two different things here because it went from 1,078. You add 301, Did I get my math right here? It's about 30%. That's the number that everybody will waive as a huge unacceptable risk.
Patsy Thompson, for the record, if you have any suggestions on how we can express it better, we will. We did try to provide the percentage increase relative to the population, but also we did try to put the acceptability of risk in the context of what is being done in other industries and for other types of carcinogens. So if you have any suggestions, we would certainly take that into consideration in revising the report.
Dr. McKeon.
Yeah, I think that's important. Again, if you go to page 87, to table, I've just picked this table purely at random. I know I'm taking it out of context, and I'm not putting it in the context of the. But again, to follow the President's argument, if I look at the excess future risk based on the 95th percentile dose, does that mean there are likely to be 25 new cancers per 100,000 population for the people who were 6 kilometers?
Patsy Thompson, for the record. Essentially, what we're talking about is individual risk and an increase in an individual's risk of getting cancer. A lot of people use those types of calculations to come up with a potential number of people who will be developing cancer. UNSCEAR, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, the International Commission on Radiation Protection for Radiation, and as well as the World Health Organization, the International Program on Chemical Safety, all speak to this is not an appropriate use of the linear no threshold model and those relationships when you have individuals exposed to very low doses. We're essentially in the range of exposures where there's a lot of uncertainty in the model. And all of these organizations speak as it's not appropriate to calculate a number of individuals who will be getting cancer. So we're talking about an increased risk of getting cancer. But it's one way to look at it.
But that's the way it will be
cases.
That's the way it will be interpreted. And I think there needs to be care given in how it's written. The other question that occurs to me in your very, very brief overview of the Chernobyl data, you give the number of childhood thyroid cancers and the number of deaths that were associated with that. Was there any increase in adult thyroid cancer? Was there any increase in breast cancers?
I'll ask Dr. Zaplatska, who's been doing research on both of those questions around Chernobyl, to answer that question.
Lydia Zablatska, for the record. I am the PI of a number of cohort studies of children and adolescents in Ukraine and Belarus. There are no studies to date that showed increased risk of thyroid cancer in the general population adults. There is one study of increased risk of thyroid cancer in adult cleanup workers. And the study was small and has a number of methodological issues, so that is not an accepted finding based on the Chernobyl 27-year follow-up.
Thank you. So I guess the final issue, you quote some Fukushima data, which is obviously still very early. If you look at the sort of the lifetime risk, it's unlikely. How confident would you be in the predictions of Fukushima risk as compared with Chernobyl risk?
Lydia Zablatska, for the record, that's an excellent question, because the Fukushima predictions use not only A-bomb, this is what was used for Chernobyl predictions, we used A-bomb data. The Fukushima predictions actually use Chernobyl data as well, so it's refined by our experience. We will not see the first cancers of thyroid cancers due to Fukushima radiation until 5 years after the accident. So these are all, of course, projections and predictions, but there is a projected increase of 70% in thyroid cancer for that population.
Childhood or adult?
Childhood.
Childhood. So I guess a final question, which I think references some of the writing around this. When you look back at the predicted cancers from Chernobyl and the 27-year rates, how well did they correlate?
We considered that the predictions that were done by the International Agency for Research on Cancer in 1994, these were the predictions for 5 million people living in Europe together. And there is no data that looked at what happened. There are only data from individual countries, for example, from Finland and Sweden and Poland. And they all reported increased risk of thyroid cancer. But whether it's due to radiation doses, other changes in environment, or screening and detection, high detection rates of thyroid cancer, it's unclear. But most of these cancer registry-based studies report the raising rates of thyroid cancer in almost all countries in Europe.
Well, all countries internationally.
Yes.
I mean, the increase of thyroid cancer has been very significant over the last 20 years, independent of whether there is a geographic association or not. And also, if you look at Canada, thyroid cancer rates in southern Ontario and southern Alberta are meaningfully higher than thyroid cancer rates in northern Ontario and northern Alberta. And again, the reason for that isn't clear. So, thank you.
So does that mean that some of the activists against nuclear says that because of all those tests and all the historical thing, we're all dying slowly? I've been hearing this quite often from a lot of people. All you need to talk to some of our unknown friends who have kept on saying that this is in the environment now, and it's slowly impacting everybody. So is there any, how else would you explain the increase in thyroid?
Certainly some of it is better detection. Absolutely.
So there's an explanation. Well, I'd like that explanation.
It's, the number of ultrasounds performed on the thyroid has increased exponentially over the last 15 to 20 years. So there is undoubtedly better detection. There is a slight increase in some cancers. The incidence of other cancers is decreasing.
Just as an observation, I really like your gray boxes in the documents that put some factoid about numbers. And actually, it would be useful. Some of them are on your page 58. You have two gray boxes about Chernobyl and Fukushima, and effect Chernobyl and Fukushima, and then the next page, health effect from Fukushima. First of all, I didn't see, maybe I missed it, there was no attribution where you get the data from on those things, and I would really encourage you to put as much recent data that just came in from Japan particularly that is really very germane, because as late as last week we saw some reports, and I'm trying to be diplomatic, that talks about Japanese kids dying from Fukushima, and it would be nice to have some credible figures in some of those reports.
So, Mr. Binder, Patsy Thompson for the record, and so the references for those two boxes are in the back of the report, but we will make a note in each box, and then so that people know that the references are at the back. And my colleague, Ms. Rickard, has just reminded me that there's a fact sheet that is being finalized for putting on our website that presents a comprehensive picture of the Chernobyl health data.
Thank you. Ms. Velshi?
Thank you. The process that you've used with this document is little different than what we've seen or used to before. Normally you do the public consultation and then come back and we get to hear what the public has had to say. So is that the plan, that after you've gone through the public consultation process, you'll come back to the Commission before the document gets finalized?
Patsy Thompson, for the record, we expected that you would give us direction in that sense. There's some options we've looked at. One option was to finalize the public review, and as we do for all documents, we will produce a table of comments we've received and how we've addressed the comments. One way to do it is to put that package of information with a final report and make you aware of it through Marc Leblanc to the Secretariat, as we've done in some occasions. The other mechanism is to come back to the Commission, as we've done for the Tritium report, for example, where the public review of the document happened, and we present the final report to the Commission. So it's at your discretion.
But I think, if memory serves, the need for such a report came up with the environmental assessment hearing of Darlington, where it was requested to do a large release study, right? So I was viewing this as a fulfilling the Commission request that should be available to when a license hearing of Darlington refurbishment will be coming in. That's the way I saw it. Is that consistent with what you just said?
Patsy Thompson, for the record, the public review period is scheduled to end at the end of August. We expect that it would take about a month to address all the comments and have a proposed final report, at least in English. And so that would sort of lead us to perhaps mid-October, end of October. So the timing with the Darlington license renewal hearing of November is perhaps a bit tight. So we can work with Marc Leblanc to see how to best approach it.
So I'm sure you'll be getting very specific direction, but I think it'll come as no surprise to you that we'll want to see what the public has to say before the report gets finalized. I thought it would be useful to put up front that this is assessing the impact of a large release, but it doesn't assess the economic impact, for instance. So here's all the things we are going to be assessing. I think it'd be important to state right up front, and here are the things we're not assessing, so people don't think this is a full picture, but that we've knowingly not included that in our scope. Something for you to think about. And you've heard it enough from my colleagues around the table, but I think having a companion document that's in a public-friendly format would be extremely helpful. So perhaps not even an executive summary, but something that covers the key messaging in a format that conveys that would be very helpful. I had a question around the source term, and if you can just take a minute to explain to me about this 1 × 10⁻14 becquerel of cesium. And what the basis of using that is, please.
So, Patsy Thompson, for the record, I'll start, and then I'll ask my colleagues behind me if they have anything to add. And so the 1 × 10⁻14 becquerels of cesium, 137, is a safety goal that the CNSC has put in a regulatory document for the design of new nuclear power reactors. That safety goal was developed through international discussions and experience analyzing the Chernobyl accident. And the basis for that number is it's a number that would essentially prevent permanent relocation, thereby preventing permanent social disruption. And that's the basis of that number, and it's been integrated into a design document for a regulatory document for design of new nuclear power reactors. So it represents a contemporary safety standard responding to the need to minimize social disruption following an accident.
So it's tied into permanent relocation as opposed to the likely health impact?
Patsy Thompson, that's correct. The assumption is that protective actions such as sheltering, evacuation, and potassium iodide administration, there's another safety goal related to iodine, so I won't speak to that one, but that protective actions such as sheltering and evacuation would be used as needed, but that amount of radioactivity would not preclude people from returning into the evacuated areas permanently, which is what happened around some of the areas in Chernobyl where people have been essentially permanently relocated from their homes.
So it's really a more restrictive goal then than the 1 in 10 million kind of safety goal.
I'll ask my colleagues behind, because there are probabilities associated with the safety goal. So,
Jerry Frappi, for the Director. I'm the Director General of Assessment and Analysis. Come to your question as to how we got the source term. We have to go back to the original question, if you like, the Commission posed, which was, give me something more severe than we've seen already. All our analysis that we've done, all the engineering design, all the environmental assessments and that, came up with potential scenarios that in fact were not severe enough from the Commission's perspective to really take a look at what these health effects might be and whatnot. So we don't have a scenario that leads to this generic large release. What we did was we said, we'll take a look at the definition of large release, as Dr. Thompson was just talking about, and we'll use that number, the 10 to the 14 release of cesium, as being a definition of a severe accident large release, and then look at the design parameters around Darlington to see what, if we had that much cesium, what would we have with respect to other radioisotopes, and from that we could create a source term. But the source term itself is a fictional creation, if you like, specifically to drive this exercise of getting this study done.
Okay. A couple of very quick ones. I noticed that you're using 2006 population data. Is something more current not available? Those are areas of fairly rapid growth in the last decade.
John Peters for the record from OPG. The data that we used is the same information that has been used in the past 2 EA studies related to Darlington. 2006 data was the most current of the day. The last census was 2011. And yes, eventually there will be good population upgrades to these tables over time. Given the timing of the study, we needed to move forward, and we felt that given that we had already in the previous studies predicted to 2025 population with good margin of safety and knowledge about growth, we were satisfied.
And I recognize it's individual risk anyway, so it wasn't, but I just wondered, the 2006 was taking out. And my, well, 2 questions. And it was more around, so what? Now that we've done this study, what are the different parties doing about it or planning on doing about it, whether it's the Fire Marshal or Emergency Measures Ontario, whether it's Health Canada, or whether it's even the CNSC? What are the next steps around that? So specifically, whether it is around the childhood thyroid risk, and I know there's some indications in here that we may want to look at our emergency plans. Maybe it's around the psychosocial impact, where we said, well, you need better communication, for instance, and does that translate that then into specific requirements down the road or guidance around that?
So, Patsy Thompson for the record, we have, following the completion or near completion of the, before we finalized the report and shortly after, met with the officials from Ontario who will be who are responsible for emergency management in the province. And we also met with Health Canada. Both indicated that they would be providing comments on the report, more detailed comments on the report during the public review period. From the CNSC perspective, having done the report, because it's one thing to stand in front of you during commission hearings and speak to the safety of Canadian nuclear reactors and say that even if there would be a severe accident, the consequences on health, because the questions we often get are related to health, would not be catastrophic. Having a report like this that essentially uses a very severe hypothetical accident that, as Mr. Frappé said, no known accident sequence could lead to such a release. So a very severe accident using site-specific weather conditions, looking at the risk models that are based on the best science, actually demonstrates what we have been saying, is that the consequences are not catastrophic. The consequences can be managed using for example, the Fukushima upgrades and the other safety improvements to Canadian nuclear power plants, using also the current provincial emergency management plans. So that information in itself is valuable in terms of a public document that we can use to speak to. In addition to that as well, CNSC staff through the IEA and the NEA have been following all of the work that is being done, that had been done post Chernobyl accident, but also the intense work that is being done post Fukushima, and that work includes looking at responding, how authorities respond to such an event, lessons learned in terms of communicating, setting expectations when the Japanese authorities, for example, shortly during and after the accident were saying that things would return to normal essentially and normal dose levels. And so having this type of message early on creates expectations that cannot necessarily be met reasonably, and having people excluded from their homes is causing a lot more problems than they would have had if they had some radiation exposure. So we are following all this activity that is being done internationally so that we can provide better advice to the authorities in terms of managing nuclear emergencies. We also have Mr. Sigouin, who's looking at those programs as well. So there's a lot being looked at from communication with the public, managing public expectations. And the focus of this report has been on what we call the early phase of the accident. But there's a lot of work being done internationally as well for the longer term period after an accident. So we will, in addition to this report, use other activities to update regulatory guidance and provide advice to others as needed.
So as aware of that, I'm just thinking of when you go public with this final document, it begs the question, so what's being done about it? And I think, whether it's on the website, that communique would be there to say, and by the way, stuff that we already have underway includes all of this, to provide a more complete picture.
Just to follow, I'm always cynical. People can use this and say, even if a disaster happens, it's not that serious. Well, our job is to make sure it doesn't happen, period. We are working about no release, which what the study did, and hypothetical, and I'm glad to see the word hypothetical, because many times, given the structure and all the mitigation that have not been credited, the study says it's very, very unlikely this will happen. So I think, to follow on Ms. Velshi, you need at the end to say, okay, we've done this study, but here is all the mitigation we've taken to prevent that even this rare event or unlikely event will not happen. And that is all the Fukushima list of initiatives. I assume they're all going to be done as per plan by the end of 2015. I'm seeing people nodding their head, so there's no slippage on that plan. That's good to hear. But I also would like to know an update, presumably from Health Canada and from the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management, about KI. If there's one conclusion here, is that the KI pills should be distributed to the home. I'm jumping here to this conclusion. You guys know where we come from on this. So where are we on that? Prior to us ordering this to happen, I'd rather it come as a consensus approach. You know, the CSA standard just now was issued. So where is the precise follow-up on the KI pill plan? So maybe I'll start with the Office of the Fire Marshal.
Thank you for that question, Dave Nodwell, for the record. So in terms of the distribution of KI, we've had the report a very short period of time, and it certainly sheds a lot of light for us in terms of the application of KI in whatever zones we're looking at. We do have a group of experts that are reviewing this report currently, and that includes health physicists and stakeholders that would be responsible for KI distribution. I would say at the outset that OFMEM acknowledges the importance of KI and is very committed to ensuring that there is an effective distribution system that's implemented in any zone that may require KI as a protective action. Now, in terms of when, and I'll presuppose that part of the question, I think it's premature because we need to determine the planning basis, and this document that we're reviewing this afternoon is an integral part of that and is a very important part of that process for us. So that's a part of it. But the other part is that any KI distribution system needs to be effective, and the public needs to know what they have, why they have it, and what to do with it. And that's a key part of our consideration, that we want to make sure that it is distributed in a fashion that will accomplish our objectives in terms of being able to protect public safety, so should something like this happen. We have been promoting KI in Durham region and Toronto in particular. I think you've seen the flashlight that was distributed, about a month ago, a bit over a month ago. And in that flashlight document, there was one of the pages that was specific to KI, and then a tear-out piece at the end that listed all of the places where KI could be obtained. Additional public education initiatives are being planned to further promote that message. But it's critical to us. One of the things that we've found in a jurisdictional scan of KI distribution is that it needs to come from a credible source, such as a doctor or a pharmacist. And so these are all of the things that we're factoring in. Once again, we are very committed to having a KI distribution system that is effective and that we are able to implement. There is a lot that we're factoring into that right now.
I hear you. We've been talking about this now for a long time, so I think we are expressing a bit of impatience in all of this. So anything we can do to help, don't be shy. Health Canada, you want to comment on this now? Or on the study? We'll wait for your formal feedback, but anything you want to say now?
Yes, thank you, Brian Eyre, for the record, Director of Radiation Protection Bureau. As with our colleagues from Ontario, we've recently received the study as part of the public consultation, so we've not yet had a chance to do a detailed review of the study. Nonetheless, we have done a preliminary scan and provided some initial feedback to CNSC staff, noting that we've felt that the technical scenario generally appears to be robust, but we did provide some specific comments on some of the technical details, again subject to a more detailed review that we will undertake during the public consultation period. However, one recommendation that we did make is that the study should be clear on how it's intended to be used in future emergency planning, and I think that cuts to the heart of the question that was asked about how this study will be used, and we would certainly appreciate clarity on that. As I said, we will continue to review the document and provide our feedback at the end of the consultation period, and we've already been discussing with CNSC staff on, for example, running the scenarios in the study using our own emergency modeling and assessment tools to see what impact that may have on dose, and we'll continue to work with the CNSC staff in that regard. Specifically with respect to KI, it's probably worth noting that we are in the process of revising our Health Canada intervention guidelines, which includes recommendations for KI usage in an emergency. That document has gone out for consultation with our provincial and federal stakeholders, and we are now in the process of reviewing that feedback, and we'll keep you apprised of what the next step of that document is, particularly with respect to potassium iodide.
Thank you. Monsieur Harvey.
Merci. Just one question. What is the sensitivity of the result and the conclusion in regard to the protective action? Should the success be lower than expected, would the conclusion be the same?
Patsy Thompson for the record. Mr. Harvey, we did make some assumptions in the report with evacuation, for example, at 10 millisievert, rather than at a higher dose level for essentially to carry out the study. We did assume 100% effectiveness of so no doses to people who are evacuated. So they're evacuated outside of the area that would be affected. And so we haven't looked and documented in the report something that would specifically address your question, but we did do some calculations. My colleague did some calculations to look at what the risk, the excess risk would be for a range of doses. For example, we did some assessments looking at doses in the range of 1 millisievert to 100 millisievert to look at what would be the increased incidence of cancer risk, taking that into consideration for adults and children for the thyroid and the all cancers combined and leukemia. And in most cases, with the range of doses we've looked at, the conclusions are not vastly different from what is documented in the report. But we did make the assumption in the report 100% effectiveness, but we did do some sensitivity analysis looking at what the other doses would have been, the consequences would have been if mitigation measures had not been taken or not successful.
It should be, add to the report this sensitivity analysis. I mean, because you will get the question from people. They say, if this doesn't work, what's the results?
Point noted. We will add information on that sensitivity analysis we did.
Okay. Any other question? Any question? Go ahead.
So just one other little comment, which I think goes back to the writing. And you've also got a slight discrepancy in numbers that you quote. In section 5.4, you have a discussion on deterministic and stochastic effects. Again, I find it very difficult to judge who you're pitching that at. It is neither a scientific discussion of stochastic effects, nor is an understandable lay discussion of. You've pitched it somewhere in between. I understand why, but I think for the final document, the other issue that you've used 49% as the cancer rate. I think it's in the stochastic piece, you mention 40%.
25.
Yeah, and so I think you need some sort of overview to make sure that those baseline numbers are consistent through the document as you try and explain what the individual risk is above that.
Patsy Thompson, for the record, will do another review. Reading the report this morning to prepare for this afternoon, I did pick up that discrepancy, and as well we use sometimes stochastic and sometimes latent effects. We've oscillated between the two. I agree.
I'd like to hear from Ms. Branch about the actual model. How credible is the model? Who else is using the model? Is it easy to use the model? Can you run other scenario on the model? Is that the right person to ask? No? Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
So Patsy Thompson, for the record, so I assume you're talking about the RAD-RAT model?
I'm talking to Ms. Branch.
So Ms. Branch did the psychosocial effects assessment.
Okay.
Dr. Zablatska was the peer review and guide.
Did the model itself, the actual running of who did the actual modeling of all of this?
Patsy Thompson, for the record. So Ms. Julie Burt, Melanie Rickard, and others in DERPA did the modeling of the health risk assessment with guidance from Dr. Zablatska, and then a peer review by Dr. Zablatska. And I'm assuming you're talking about the health effects. OPG did the max code running.
So OPG, how complex and how difficult it is to run this software?
Alan Webster, for the record. I'll ask Carlo Lorenz, our Director of Nuclear Safety, to answer that question.
The part of the model, Carlos Lorenz says, for the record, the part of the model that refers to the distribution, the dispersion of the plume, is called MAX2. It's a well-known model developed by the NRC. We have the NUREC CR6613, which provides the user's manual. It has all the options available for the user. The user and the person who prepares this information goes to intensive training, and then is appropriate for this person to work on this. The model is not complex, but offers many options. Once you have the proper information, winds, magnitude, direction, population, divides everything into 10 rings, 16 sectors, and you have an enormous amount of data to look at. It's not difficult, it's rather simple, but you need the training for that.
Okay, thank you. For Ms. Branch, you spoke about the societal effect, I guess, socioeconomic effect. You mentioned a couple of places that you may want to rethink about the evacuation, where sometimes evacuation itself can be more harmful than sheltering or non-evacuating. What I really would like advice from you, how do you know when event started and you got to make a decision, how does one figure out whether to evacuate or not to evacuate, when to evacuate? Because all I hear is always the protective measure should trump anything else. When does a socioeconomic issue trump preventive measures?
This is Christy Branch, for the record, and I think that there is not a clear base of information to make a determination like that. And I think that the information that's coming out from Fukushima will be very instructive to provide better information about the kinds of consequences that occur with evacuation in terms of psychosocial effects, as well as some of the economic consequences of evacuation. I think that one of the problems is that the control of evacuation is not entirely, that evacuations are not entirely under the control of the people who are giving the direction. And I think there's some historical evidence that if people have information that there might be a radioactive release, that people may decide to evacuate on their own, even if the directive is not given to evacuate. So I think that the kind of complicated issues that are involved in that are not entirely understood. There's quite a bit of information about other kinds of natural hazards and evacuation. But I think that the kind of concern that people have about exposure to radioactive materials complicates that question.
Okay, thank you for that. I heard a couple of times I saw on your slide this that anything lower than 1 in 100,000 is essentially negligible. Is that written anywhere?
Patsy Thompson, for the record, it is written in numerous guidance documents, both in Canada, the U.S., Australia, the World Health Organization, the IPCS. There's numerous places where this guidance is used. It's essentially used to guide as one input into people for risk managers. And for example, the assessments that are done in Canada for priority substances under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act will use those guides as whether a substance is for high or low priority for risk management. And generally, when the incremental risk is less than 1 in 100,000, is judged to be essentially negligible or low priority for risk management. And it's the zone in between that people tend to focus on.
So in many cases, you do reach that less than 1 in 100,000. Yet we're always facing with this linear no threshold model that there is no limit, and particularly if you now start talking about cumulative effect, etc., etc. It seems to me like all of this is kind of in conflict with each other, at least as far as the public understanding of this.
What I would say is that this guidance is available both for radiation, but also the organizations I mentioned, like the World Health Organization, ICPS, have similar guidance for chemical carcinogens. So carcinogens that also have an effect on chromosomes or DNA are dealt with in the same way as radiation, using linear models to assess risk and using those benchmarks or risk benchmarks to aid in decision making. The WHO and other organizations have also made similar statements as UNSCEAR and ICRP that the linear models should not be used at the very low exposure levels to estimate the number of people who will either get cancer or die from cancer. And so the same caveats are put for chemical risks, and which leads me to believe that people who deal with chemical management face the same reaction from the public that we do, that people don't accept any risk from chemicals or radiation, even knowing that the baseline cancer risk is high. So it's a challenge for us to present that information. But by benchmarking with what others are doing, I think it helps to at least indicate that the judgments that are being made on acceptability of risk for radiation and for the CNSC, for example, for the industry we regulate, is not outside of what is being done by other regulators for other types of industries.
My last comment really is still relating to that subject. On your page 30, you try to explain what is a radiological dose. And, looking at what happened in Japan, the last sentence below this table, you make this statement that the 1 millisievert per year is a regulatory limit. It's not a health limit. And this has been a dilemma this is a dilemma for that Japan is now living that, whereas everybody likes to differentiate between the regulatory limit. The population will not go back unless it's below 1 millisievert because population view it as a health limit. And we've been talking about 1 millisievert as I don't think we've done a good job differentiating between a regulatory limit and a health limit.
Patsy Thompson, for the record, you probably know I will agree with you, but more seriously, we do have a fact sheet that is almost ready for posting on our website that addresses some of those questions. And you rightly point out, for example, that the ICRP has recommendations for returning after people have been evacuated that are in the range of 1 to 20 millisievert. And so the ICRP has also done a lot of education in Fukushima in the affected communities for people to have access to information on health effects and risks so people can make decisions for themselves. But it is a challenge, especially when authorities say that after the accident everything will go back to normal, and 1 millisievert was used to define normal. Well, and so it is a challenge, and hopefully if there's one lesson learned from Fukushima is that authorities will not make statements like that if there's an accident.
But we spoke about a serious accident, 7 days, and it's kind of silent about the recovery, and etc. And you may want to close the loop by just saying something about what's the current practice, the 20 millisievert recovery, something about that is now kind of a new piece of information that being promoted internationally as a safe kind of environment. And that should be consistent, I think, with Health Canada trying to rewrite their recovery guidance.
Patsy Thompson, for the record, we'll look at the report and see where best that additional information would fit.
Okay, anything else? So let me echo what colleagues said. I'm a fan of doing such studies so we can gain more insight as to what possibly can happen and what do we need to do to mitigate. So it's a mitigation side to me, which is the takeaway as to what we're going to do next. But to know what to do next, you have to do the study. And so good work, and let's see what the comment they'll come back to us on this. So thank you.